It was the winter of 2018, just after New Year's. I lived in a small house on the edge of a frozen lake. Up north, the cold isn't just weather, it's a physical weight. That night, a massive blizzard had basically buried the town. The snow was already 3 feet deep and still falling. I was actually relieved to be stuck inside. With the fireplace going, the house felt like a fortress. I grabbed a heavy wool blanket and settled onto the sofa. I figured I'd just drift off to the sound of the wind. I didn't expect the wind to start sounding like people. I slept for a few hours, a deep, heavy slumber. But around 2 in the morning, I jolted awake. My heart was racing, and I wasn't sure why. There was this rhythmic thudding coming from the front of the house. It was soft, like someone tapping a gloved hand against wood. In my half-asleep state, I thought it was a dream. I sat up and waited, holding my breath. The house was silent, save for the rattling window panes. I told myself it was just a branch or the house settling, but the feeling of being watched was already setting in. I decided I'd feel better if I just went upstairs to bed. I stood up and started turning off the lamps. The shadows in the hallway seemed longer than usual. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. As I approached the stairs, I had to pass the front door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the light switch. Cold draft was seeping in through the frame. I knew I wouldn't sleep unless I checked the porch. I leaned in to look through the small peephole. The glass was completely obscured by a thick layer of frost. It was like looking into a clouded, white eye. I sighed, feeling a bit ridiculous for being so paranoid. But then, I decided to just open the door for a second. I turned the deadbolt and pulled it open just a crack. The freezing air hit my face like a physical blow. The porch was empty, and the world was a whiteout. I couldn't see more than a few feet into the driveway. But when I looked down at the fresh snow, I froze. There were no footprints, but something was very wrong. 2 deep trenches were carved into the snow leading to the door. It looked like someone had dragged their feet through the drifts. The marks came right up to the threshold where I stood. Then, they simply stopped, as if the person had just vanished. There were no tracks leading away from the house. I slammed the door shut and threw every lock I had. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the wind carving patterns in the snow. I hurried upstairs, my skin crawling with unease. I climbed into bed, pulling the duvet up to my chin. I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation playing tricks. I eventually fell into a restless, shivering sleep. But when I woke up again, it wasn't because of a sound. It was the temperature. The air in my bedroom was biting, almost painful. I could see a thick mist forming in front of my face. It took me a second to realize it was my own breath. The house felt as cold as the frozen lake outside. Something had happened to the furnace while I slept. I sat up, my teeth beginning to chatter uncontrollably. I reached for the lamp, but the switch did nothing. The power was out, which explained why the heat died. I fumbled for my phone to check the time. It was only 4 in the morning, the darkest part of night. I knew I had to go downstairs to check the thermostat, but the thought of that front door made my blood run cold. I didn't want to know what was waiting in the dark. I forced myself to step out into the dark hallway. The floorboards felt like sheets of ice beneath my bare feet. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me in the moonlight. I kept my back against the wall, moving with agonizing slowness. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down. The living room below was a pit of absolute blackness. I had to know why the heat had stopped working. I had to know if I was truly alone in this house. I reached the thermostat mounted near the bottom of the stairs. I fumbled for the plastic cover, my fingers nearly numb. When I finally touched the dial, my stomach dropped. It had been turned all the way to the off position. I was 100% certain I hadn't touched it. I tried to flick the switch back to heat, but the digital display remained dark and lifeless. The power wasn't just out. The entire system was dead. I decided right then that I was calling the police. I turned to head back up the stairs for my phone. That's when I heard it, a sound I knew by heart. It was the distinct, heavy squeak of the leather couch. It only made that noise when someone sat down on it. I froze, my foot hovering over the first wooden step. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Slowly, I turned my head to look into the den. My eyes adjusted to the dim silver light from the window. There, sitting perfectly still on my couch, was a man. He wasn't rummaging through my things or looking for a TV. He was just sitting there, shoulders squared, facing the wall. Then, he slowly rotated his head to look at me. His eyes were wide and lifeless, reflecting the moon like a predator. He wasn't frowning or angry. He was smiling. There was a thin, tight-lipped grin that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't say a word, just stared right through me. I felt a wave of pure, cold terror wash over me. This wasn't a robbery. This was something much more sinister. I didn't wait for him to stand up or move. I lunged for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. My lungs burned as I gasped in the freezing air. I could hear my own frantic footsteps echoing in the house. I didn't look back to see if he was following me. I just needed to get behind a door with a lock. I reached the landing and scrambled into my bedroom. I slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped my phone. I dialed 911 and collapsed against the far wall. I whispered my address to the operator, terrified of being heard. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement in the hallway. A long, dark shadow stretched across the gap under my door. He was standing right there, just inches away from me. There was a long, agonizing silence where I didn't even breathe. Then came 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the wood. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't a request to enter. It was a taunt. He knew I was trapped, and he was enjoying it. He was playing with me like a cat with a mouse. I huddled in the corner, clutching a heavy glass lamp. The operator told me to stay on the line and stay quiet, but the cold was becoming an enemy of its own. Every time I breathed, the white mist filled the room. I could hear the wind howling outside, mocking my isolation. I listened for the sound of the door being kicked in, but instead, I heard the soft creak of floorboards retreating. He was walking back toward the stairs, taking his time. The psychological weight of his silence was crushing. I realized he might have been in my house for hours, watching me sleep while the temperature slowly plummeted. It felt like an eternity before I saw the blue flashes. The police lights cut through the frost on my bedroom window. I didn't leave the room until I heard them shouting my name. When I finally went downstairs, the front door was ajar. The officers searched every inch of the property and the yard, but the man on the couch was long gone. There were no new tracks in the fresh snow outside. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the blizzard. The police thought he might have picked the lock to enter, but I knew better. He hadn't come for my money. This next account took place back in the winter of 2013. I was living in a quiet, forested neighborhood on the edge of town. It was just me and my dog, a massive Siberian husky named Ghost. Ghost had these piercing, ice-blue eyes that seemed to see everything. In the winter, our routine was always the same, regardless of the cold. He lived for the snow, and I lived for our nightly walks. That night, I got home from my shift around 9 in the evening. The air was biting, but Ghost was already waiting by the door. I grabbed his leash, not knowing our routine was about to shatter. We headed toward the trail that wound through the thick woods behind us. It was a forest preserve that connected several of the local parks. The snow was deep, crunching loudly under my heavy winter boots. Everything was silent in that way, only a midwinter night can be. No cars, no wind, just the sound of our breathing in the dark. The moonlight reflected off the white ground, casting long, eerie shadows. Ghost was usually full of energy, pulling me along the frozen path. We were about half a mile in when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. The woods felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were leaning in. I felt a prickle of unease on the back of my neck. A vibrate. Suddenly, Ghost stopped dead in his tracks and perked his ears. He didn't bark. He just stood there, perfectly still like a statue. I watched him, thinking he'd spotted a deer or a stray cat. But his eyes weren't scanning the brush. They were locked behind us. I turned around slowly, looking back down the empty moonlit trail. There was nothing but the black silhouettes of the pines and snow. I tugged on his leash, trying to get him to keep moving. He resisted at first, his gaze never wavering from the darkness. Eventually he followed, but his tail was tucked between his legs. He knew something was out there, even if I couldn't see it. We hurried back to the house, the silence feeling more like a threat. Once we were inside, I locked the door and let Ghost off leash. He seemed to relax a bit, heading straight for his water bowl. I tried to shake off the feeling and started making some dinner. I threw some leftovers into the microwave, the humming filling the kitchen. I stood there, watching the plates spin, trying to rationalize my fear. It was just a coyote, I told myself, or maybe just the wind. But the memory of Ghost's frozen posture kept playing in my head. The microwave beeped, echoing through the quiet, empty house. I took my food to the living room, desperate for some normalcy. I had only been sitting for 10 minutes when Ghost started howling. It wasn't his usual, "I want a treat" howl. It was mournful. He was standing by the large bay window, his fur standing up. I walked over to him, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The blinds were open, showing the dark, snowy yard stretching out. I hushed him, straining my ears to hear anything from the outside. The yard was bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. Nothing moved, no shadow shifted, and the gate was still closed. But Ghost refused to move, his eyes fixed on the glass pane. He was staring at something I was completely failing to perceive. I leaned in closer to the window, trying to see the porch. That's when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The entire window was covered in a thick layer of white frost, except for one small circular patch right at my eye level. The frost had been melted away in a perfect clear ring. It looked exactly like the mark left by someone's warm breath. Someone had been standing right there, pressed against the glass, watching me eat my dinner from the safety of the darkness. I grabbed the cord and slammed the blinds shut with a bang. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the plastic. I backed away from the window, pulling Ghost along with me. I went through the house, checking every single lock and latch. The kitchen window, the back door, the basement entry, all were secure. The feeling of being watched didn't go away with the blinds. I felt exposed, as if the walls of my home had become transparent. Who would stand in sub-zero temperatures just to look inside? I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That a dog barked and there was a smudge on my window. I decided to wait, hoping whoever it was had already moved on. I sat back down on the couch, but I didn't touch my food. I turned on the TV and lowered the volume to a whisper. I needed the light, but I needed to be able to hear. Ghost curled up at my feet, his head resting on my ankles. His ears were still twitching, reacting to every creak of the house. The movie playing on the screen was just a blur of colors. I kept my eyes on the front door, waiting for the handle to turn. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an agonizing hour. The blizzard outside was picking up, rattling the window frames. I was trapped in a fortress that no longer felt like home. Ghost's head snapped up, his ears swiveling toward the front of the house. I followed his gaze to the heavy oak door. Then came the sound that shattered the midnight silence. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks echoed through the entryway. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I grabbed Ghost's collar, pulling him close to hush his low growl. The blizzard was screaming outside, but these knocks were unmistakable. They weren't the wind or a branch hitting the siding. "Hello?" a voice called out from the freezing dark. It was a man's voice, muffled by the thickness of the door. "Is anyone home?"